Old man threatens to kill me and my entire family. My story isn't that spectacularly scary, but it was extremely creepy and very real, so here it goes. About 2 months ago, I had gone to McDonald's at around 7:30 a.m. to buy a BBQ breakfast burger. Can't remember the burger's name before I started class. The McDonald's is in a mall, so the seating is just one large food court. Anyways, I'm very shy and introverted, so I want to find a quiet spot around the edge of the food court to eat my burger. I find a seat and there are only 2 middle-aged ladies sitting to the side of me, and this one man around his 50s, 60s, obese, sitting to the other side, eating a tin of sardines. I sit down, put my bag on my lap and start eating. During the consumption of my very unhealthy yet delicious burger, the old man begins mumbling things to himself. It's very faint, and I don't take too much notice of it, as he appeared to be a man who had a bit going on upstairs, if you know what I mean. Anyways, quickly his mumbling becomes slightly louder and clearer, and at this point, I can fully understand what he's saying. He's talking about murdering people, saying he'll slit someone's mother's throat, mentioning it wouldn't be hard to track down someone and kill them and their entire family. He went on with these threats for a while. The list of threats were more extensive, but it was a while ago and I cannot remember much. I'm thinking at the time he's on the phone to somebody, so I'm more skittish than scared. I expertly take a glance at him by pretending to be alerted by someone's tray hitting the table, and then turning my head towards the man. I look at him, and there he is, no phone in sight, staring directly at me with the dirtiest, most malevolent look. Now I am scared. Being very shy, I try to avoid any aggressive and violent confrontations with anybody, so I finish my burger, but I just stay seated drinking my water because I still gotta wait over an hour to go to school, and he continues with the mumbling threats. I'm stupidly shy, but I know when enough is enough. Is this guy seriously talking about slitting my mother's throat? I begin to work up the courage to say something to him. I'm thinking something along the lines of, what did you say to me? I also have the non-emergency police number, ready to use it as a threat. I delay it as long as possible, and finally he finishes with his canned sardines. He gets up to throw the cans away, and when he goes back to his seat, he packs up his bag, ready to leave. I'm pretty fucking relieved. At this point, I'm thinking, whoa, I can't believe I got scared. This guy clearly has a few mental problems. To note, he's still mumbling the death threats, which I've come to the conclusion he's not directing them at me, personally. They're just a general thing, as he's definitely messed up psychologically. But it's not over yet. As he's standing up and packing up his bags to go, he looks at me, and I look at him and he says, "I'll see you very soon, boy," and walks off. So that's my personal let's not meet again story. Not horrifying, but it's the truth. Since that morning, I have not seen him again, nor has my family been brutally slain yet. You don't die, right? Like many others, I'm a long-time lurker here. I've learned so much about personal defense, and I am so thankful for the knowledge of others. This story is not nearly as creepy as many others, but has stuck with me for well over 15 years. When I was about 15 to 16, my beloved grandfather had a very dangerous heart surgery. Thankfully, he survived and was placed in a nearby convalescent home. I visited him there often, as the place depressed him, and I liked talking to the other older adults that stayed there. Most of them were completely normal and with it. However, on one visit, I had stopped at a local chocolate shop, so as to sneak in a treat for my grandpa. I walked in and nodded to the nurse, who recognized me by now. As I trotted down the hall, an elderly woman in a wheelchair, who I hadn't seen before, started yelling, "What's in your bag? What's in your bag?" I was carrying the chocolate in a brown paper lunch bag, and figured she was just interested and suffering from dementia. She rambled some other incoherent things, and eventually she rolled up to me. At that moment, she grabbed my arm like a vice. This very elderly 90-pound woman had the grip of a hawk. Being 15 and generally pleasant, I simply told her I needed to see my grandpa. At that point, she violently yanked me so my ear was up against her cheek, and her eyes seemed to take of a more lucid cast. She shifted me into her gaze and said, "Beware, young lady. I know that you don't die, right?" Frightened, I went and saw my grandpa and didn't say anything about it. He loved a chocolate treat. Hours later, I left and walked by the same nurse's station. That old woman was still there, or I come back, and started screaming at the top of her lungs, "You don't die, right? You don't die, right? Just you wait." I screeched and ran out. Luckily, my grandpa left shortly afterwards, and lived at the ripe age of 93, dying in his bed, peacefully, in case you wondered. Of course, it is highly likely that this woman suffered from dementia. Still, in the ensuing 15 years, if I ever had any close calls, or felt my hackles rise while walking down the street, I would hear a whisper in my ear, "You don't die, right? You don't die, right?" I'm not a superstitious person, but some small part of me wonders if she was right. Scary lady in wheelchair, let's not meet again. Elderly dog owner turns out to be a child molester. So this happened to me about 9 years ago when I was 10 years old. We had just moved about an hour away from where we used to live in Germany, by the way. But I still had to go back twice a week because my gymnastics practice. On Tuesday's practice, it ended about 9 p.m. And as always, I had to use public transport to get home. Careless parents. I also had to change means of transport 4 times, so when I got out of the tube subway, I had to wait for the bus often up to 20 minutes. So one time, I was waiting for said bus when a big white dog came up to me and started sniffing me. Shortly after, the owner, a man in his late 50s, sat down next to me and told me not to be afraid of the dog. I said I wasn't, as we had one too, and he started to ask me about my dog and then about myself, how old I was, where I lived, etc. This alarmed me, and I got scared because I noticed there was no one else around, and it was already quite dark outside. I answered all of his questions without giving any real information except about my age. He then told me that he's having sex with a lot of young girls, and how he especially likes to eat them out, but that I would still be a little bit too young for him. He said he preferred girls from the ages of 12 to 14, and that he was really looking forward to meeting me again in 2 years. I didn't know what to say, so I just sat there in complete silence with him, staring at me, smiling creepily, until my bus arrived and I got in. I remember feeling dirty and ashamed, and I wasn't sure whether to tell my mom or not. But when I found the courage to do so, she didn't care. I was too scared to go to practice again, so I quit. And only years after that, I realized how lucky I was that nothing happened, and that it was a good idea to not go back again. My elderly stalker. I used to work at an office supply store in the copy center. There was an elderly man named Tom with my same last name. He would come in to get copies made, and I would always talk to him because I thought he was a sweet, lonely old man. After several months of him regularly coming in, one of my coworkers was speaking to him and made a joke about how I was newly single and maybe I should go for an older guy. He took her seriously and started coming in almost daily. I started to get worried when he started calling me beautiful all the time and started trying to touch me across the counter. I tried to keep my distance, but he began to go near the opening and get close to me. I finally told him he made me uncomfortable when he tried to kiss me on the cheek. He got really angry and started to yell at me. After that, everyone was on the lookout, and when he would enter the store, one of my male coworkers would confront him immediately and not let him talk to me. We couldn't figure out how he always knew when I was working, until a coworker made a comment about my grandfather picking me up. I immediately knew it was my stalker because both my grandfathers had passed. He was always calling to find out when I was off so he could wait for me outside. The police were called when we noticed a large white van with no windows parked outside whenever I was working. I'd already been walked to and from my car the whole time. But that was when the police were called and he was taken away. I know he was older, but he had no family and nothing else to lose. He scared the shit out of me. Creepy Tommy. I started working on a rose farm around 4 years ago. My brother turned me on to an opening, and my Aunt Lily and I were hired on the spot, given our different backgrounds in horticulture. It was harder work than I had anticipated, as we had not only had to tend to the roses in the greenhouses, but also had to deal with the monster plants out in the huge garden. There was no air conditioning, and when the temperatures climbed in the summer months, we found shade whenever possible. There were plenty of trees and storage buildings, and some of the climbing roses had grown so dense that during breaks, we would just sometimes chill along the pathway they had grown over. We sat on our own hours and our own boss, a terrible dragon of a woman who was blessedly rarely there to breathe down our necks. From here on out, we will call her Boss Dragon. My brother was fired after being accused of breaking into her house. He hadn't. No one had, we later learned. She was just batshit bonkers. But my aunt and I stayed on until family obligations kept her home more often than not. There was also a revolving door of workers who came and went, usually due to how unpleasant our boss was. But the one constant was Tommy. Tommy was an older man, who was nice enough, if not a bit odd. He had worked there for 9 years at that point. Towards the end of the first year, he and I were the only ones working the farm, and he seemed pretty harmless, if not a bit off-putting. Our conversations during our breaks were innocent and innocuous enough. I learned he had moved from West Virginia some years earlier with his elderly mother, but he never told me why his family up there never talked to him, and I never asked. I'm a private person, and I figured it wasn't any of my business. But as time went by, things began steering straight into Creepy Town. Tommy would ask me about my boyfriend, ask weird shit like if we ever kissed, if we shared a bed together, if we were getting married. Each time I told him that I didn't think those were appropriate things to ask a coworker, and it seemed like that was that. Now, Tommy had always a bit of a staring problem. I thought it was due to bad socialization, but it was really fucking weird. The staring became worse somehow when he started working on the opposite side of the property. Sometimes I would catch him crouched beneath a large bush or beneath a tree, just watching me work. If I saw him beneath a shade tree or beneath the climbers, I would go and sit in my car and have my break there. Tommy was also incredibly quiet when he moved. Sometimes I would stand up to find him right behind me. I have horribly bad anxiety, and this did not bode well. It got so bad that I told him straight up to stop or I would clock him. I asked Boss Dragon about him one day during one of her upswings, and she confided me that while he had been working there for years, she didn't know very much about him. She assured me, however, that he wouldn't harm a fly. Boss Dragon had a penchant for lying her ass off. That first summer turned to fall, and when winter hit, the job ended. I started back the next year, happy to be working outside again. I had almost completely forgotten about Tommy, but there he was, working away. I spoke to him as little as possible, and when we had a new hire, I always made sure to stick around them, even if their stays was only temporary. During Lily's sporadic work days, I always stayed glued to her hip, but there were still days, too many, where I was alone with Tommy. One day, while reading a rose bush, I stepped into a nest of yellow jackets. I went straight to Boss Dragon's house, where her now ex-husband Steve, a dearly sweet man, who I now consider one of my best friends, gave me a Benadryl, watched me make sure I wasn't allergic with EpiPen in hand, and offered me a place to sleep it off in their guest room. When I decided to go home, Boss Dragon had Tommy follow me in the work truck in case something happened. I wish I put my foot down and said no, but if you ever angered A bunch of yellow jackets. You know how much their stings hurt. I just wanted to get home before the Benadryl kicked in and made me go to sleep. I didn't realize that gave Tommy the perfect opportunity to know where I lived. How he learned about where my aunt lived, however, is still a mystery. Now, I visited Lily a lot since she lived maybe 5 minutes from me. Next to her was a public park where people were always coming and going. One day, I got a call saying that Tommy had been standing on the path that led into the park, and when she asked what he was doing, he told her that he knew I visited often and that he had hoped to see me. My aunt is a bit of a badass and told him to stop being creepy and to go away. It was public property, however, and Tommy could do whatever he wanted. What made it extra creepy is that Tommy didn't drive. So he had ridden his bicycle from his trailer near the Rose Farm, nearly 20 miles to the park next to Lily's house. I told Boss Dragon and she shrugged it off, but revealed to me that he often rode into my town and had been in my subdevelopment because he had told that one day I wasn't at home. He said I was always either at home or my aunt's. It slowly dawned on me what was happening. He was stalking me. Boss Dragon said she would handle it, even gave me a hug. She didn't do anything though, and I will never forgive her for that. Very little scares me. I'm a tomboy who grew up in the country. Tommy, though smallish and in his 50s, scared me. I would see him in town, or at the intersection by my housing development, just standing and staring as if he were waiting. I quit my job soon after and thought that was that. I grew really paranoid. I would sit on my front stoop with a baseball bat for hours on end, just waiting for him to come up, but he never did. He did most of his stalking when he knew I wouldn't see him. He was sneaky. That scared me the most. Soon after I quit, one of my wheels came loose from my car, and I'm lucky that I work excellent in a crisis, because if I had not pulled over, the tire would have liberated itself from my back bumper, where it was stuck, and I didn't even want to know what would have happened. He continued stalking the park, continued stalking my neighborhood. I gave my neighbors a heads up. Lily grew increasingly tired of coming out in her yard, only to see him standing in the park's path, staring with a cigarette perched between his lips, waiting. Driving past the Rose Farm one day, she saw Tommy standing by the old farm truck. Lily stopped, threw her car into reverse, and swerved into the parking lot. She got out of the car and started asking him questions, which she would not answer. She became so mad, my little spitfire of an aunt, that she kicked the side of the truck hard enough to dent it, to keep it from kicking him. That was enough to get him to answer the next question. She asked him if he really believed that he and I were in a relationship. He said yes. I'd never done anything to lead this man on. Against her better judgment, she threatened him, but honestly, I love her for that. It bought me a few weeks of peace. I returned to the Rose Farm with my aunt and boyfriend to get our things eventually. Coolers and tools that we used, because Boss Dragon was too cheap to buy the tools required for the job. Tommy was walking along the road, staring, and when my aunt told him to keep walking, he crossed the street and crouched down in the trees, and just kept staring and smoking his cigarette. Lily called the cops. The officer came, a super nice young man, and his presence sent Tommy running off through the woods. I told him what was up, and he told me that if he tried anything to get a restraining order. Then he went to speak to Tommy at his trailer. After that, the phone calls began. I don't know how he got my number. At first, I would tell him to fuck off, and he would say creepy shit like how he would never hurt me. So I started to ignore him. He texted me things about how much he loved me, drew a rate when I didn't answer. He even told me to erase the text from my phone. He wouldn't stop, and ignoring him just seemed to push him further. He kept it up until I blocked him, but he continued his daily rides into town and to the park to my aunt's house. We were also pretty sure that he loosened the lug nuts on my car. So was the cop we talked to and the judge, but without evidence there was nothing we could do. That was the last straw for my boyfriend Tim. Tim was a very sweet and level-headed man. Confronted him next. The car had barely stopped when he jumped out of it and asked him what his deal was. Again, Tommy was asked if he thought I was his girlfriend. Again, he said yes, even though I made it extremely clear that I wasn't. That was the confrontation that caused Tommy to drop his simpering idiot act. It's hard to describe. I was sitting in my car with my aunt, and it was like the man had a shark's eye. I went to the courthouse as soon as I could, and was terrified that they wouldn't believe me, despite the text and witness testimony. I filled out the appropriate forms, and then went to speak in front of the judge. I watched other people go up, give their stories, and quite a few were sent home empty-handed. The judge was as cold as ice, and I was so terrified. I pride myself on keeping my composure, but when I went up there and began speaking, I just burst into tears. I didn't feel safe in my home. I didn't feel safe in my own town. He was so quiet when he moved, you see, that I had never heard him sneaking up behind me. My sleep was plagued with nightmares where he bashed my brains in with a brick paver from the garden. To my surprise, the judge's demeanor changed. He issued an emergency restraining order then and there, and told me to come back the next week for a more permanent one. He didn't even ask to see the text. Tommy never even showed up to defend himself. He wasn't allowed anywhere near me, and the cops checked up on me from time to time, which was extremely nice and comforting. I grew comfortable again, but it took a long time. Summer came again, and Boss Dragon called if I would like to work. The thing was, she wouldn't fire Tommy. When she eventually fired him, I still said no thanks, told her to eat a bag of dicks, and later learned that he had pulled the same shit on an employee years before, and she had done nothing. When Boss Dragon eventually abandoned him, my aunt, boyfriend, and I grew close to her ex-husband, and he told us that his wife had never told him what was going on, since the Rose Farm was her baby, and he was a doctor with insane hours. Steve had no real way of knowing. We didn't talk to him, rarely saw him when he worked there. He was absolutely mortified and apologetic. With Tommy gone, we worked for the ex-husband for a year to help him close the Rose Farm down. I also found out that Tommy had gotten into trouble in West Virginia for sexual assault, and that was why he moved down here. So here's to you, Tommy, you fucking creep. Let us never meet again. Casually brushed off being groomed by an old man. This happened 6 to 7 years ago when I was around 13 and still in school. Walking home one day, going through town, the weather was unbearable. Not like that sunny vibe sort of warmth, but the horrible bastard heat blanket type that suffocates the shit out of you. Anyways, I took out some of my school uniforms, which consisted of a heavy wool blazer, long-sleeved gray jumper and tie. This was a mandatory outfit living in Ireland and going to a grammar school. Heavy-ass coats that people have been wearing since 1667, when the shit first opened. With just a short-sleeved shirt on, I headed about my merry way when this old man beckoned to me to come over from across the street. He was about 60, 70 from memory, with a little driving cap and leather jacket on. Now, this is something that has landed me in trouble before. I cannot simply turn down a conversation, regardless of when the typical local junkies approach or clear red flag scenarios unfold. I always entertain the fucking thing unintentionally. So, I walk over to this dude thinking, hey, maybe he just needs directions or something like that. First thing he asks is, do you want some sweets? And offered a Terry's chocolate orange. When I reached out to take a piece, he just held my hand, like straight up, staring into my eyes, held my hand, rubbing it slowly. Then he asked, would you like to come back to my house for a cup of tea? Surely you must be tired and thirsty. Now, I know the sensible thing to do here was to call for an adult, seeing as there was hundreds around. Belfast is a busy place. There was also police that often patrolled the street. All I had to do was shout or make a scene. Instead, what came out of my mouth was, nah dude, that's kinda gay. Without any resistance, I released myself from his grip, took another piece of chocolate orange, and walked back over to my bus stop. Looking over my shoulder, he just stared back at me, mouth open, and after a few seconds, hurried off around the corner. I realize now that the smart thing to do was to report him, seeing as how this could have happened to anybody else my age, and that this man could still be out there. This is the first time I've ever told this story, so nobody else knows about it. Although the immediate danger wasn't there. I think the implication warrants a mention. Nevertheless, chocolate orange possible child molester, let's not meet.